Testing. Test. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله عليه الصلاة والسلام. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله عليه وآله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم اجعل قلبي بارا وعملي سارا وعيشي كارا ورزقي دارا ولاد ابرارا واجعل عند كبر نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم واتقرا وقرارا برحمتك. صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد.
Loud salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى. نحمده ونستعينه ونثني عليه ونؤمن به. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف بريته ومبلغ رسالاته العبد المؤيد الرسول المسدد المحمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin this first Friday khutbah by reminding all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We had continued our discussion on the topic of dedication to worship, and we touched on this point that the author of 40 hadith was speaking about the reality behind the acts of worship that we carry out. And he mentioned that many verses of the Quran point to the idea that every deed that the human being commits, everything that he does, has a spiritual reality behind it. And that this spiritual reality is something that we don't interact with in this world. It is only after we leave this world and enter into the world of akhirah where the Quran tells us that then we deal with the spiritual realities of these deeds. That's why the verses of the Quran very clearly from time to time they point to the idea that on the day of judgment you are not dealing with the reward or the punishment of your deeds. You are dealing with the deeds themselves. That's why the verse of the Quran says, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةً خَيْرًا yarahu, whoever does even a small amount of good will see that good on the day of judgment. وَمَن يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا yarahu, whoever does anything of bad deeds will see the bad deed itself on that day. And we went through the narrations that spoke about the situation where the human being prays. After his prayer is done, his salat is a living reality, and his salat addresses him and speaks to him. If he did a good job with his salat praises him, prays for him, supplicates for him. If he did a poor job with his salat, then his salat speaks negatively towards him. So the author continues, he says, therefore we find that the role of the Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet was for them because they have a deeper appreciation of the realm of the unseen. They have a deeper appreciation of the Day of Judgment. Their role was to go and bring to us and inform us of the spiritual realities of our different deeds. So when the Prophet of God says, this is haram, you're not supposed to do it, or sometimes we tell our children, you shouldn't do this, God won't be happy with it, God will punish you. If we wanted to get a little bit more technical, that is incorrect, that is inaccurate. The more technical approach is, this deed that you're engaging in, it has a spiritual reality that will punish your soul. It has a spiritual reality that will bring pain to your soul. And that is the pain that one experiences, God forbid, on the Day of Judgment or in hellfire. So he says the role of the Ahlul Bayt was for them to come back as messengers. You know, if you send someone to go to another country you've never been to, that person returns from that back country, he comes and he starts telling you about what's happening over there. He tells you, over there, this is very valuable. Over there, they don't care about this too much. Over there, if you carry this is a problem. This is what the Ahlul Bayt have done, except as it relates to, instead of another country, an unseen world, alamul ghayb, that world that you and I do not see. Yes? Okay. Now, if my acts of worship are acts of worship that if they are done well, they are shining brightly. They have good quality. If they're not done well, then the Ahlul Bayt told us they speak negatively of us. They address you and they complain that you did this act of worship, but you didn't put your heart into it, didn't put your effort into it. So he says, this is why the Ahlul Bayt have taught us so much that if you don't do a good job with your salat, this is why the nawafil are legislated for you. The nawafil are the daily prayers. And unfortunately, in our communities, in the average culture we have in our communities, nawafil is not even a thing. So you tell our children nawafil, they're like, what are you even talking about? My issue is not the 16-year-old. If the 16-year-old is praying his 5 daily prayers, that's really good. That's amazing. It's not easy. You know, I remember talking to one parent and said, Sheikh, my son, he doesn't do the mustahab prayers. I said, well, how old is your son? He's 13. I said, well, there's a reason why it's not wajib on him at such a young age. But this needs to become part of our culture. What are nawafil? Nawafil are those daily mustahab prayers that were legislated because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that you and I would not necessarily do the best job with the wajib prayers. So they said what? The nawafil are legislated to make up for the lack of attention that you have during the time of the wajib prayers. Yes? So this is why we find from the 5th Imam, Al-Imam Al-Baqir, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Ilal al-Shara'i' has narrated, the author of Ilal al-Shara'i' is Shaykh al-Saduq. إِنَّمَا جُعِلَتِ النَّافِلَةِ, the nafila was legislated for you, لِيَتِمَّ بِهَا مَا يَفْسُدُ مِنَ الْفَرِيضَةِ, to make up for those parts that you don't do a good job with during the time of your prayer. And in another narration, the 6th Imam, Al-Imam Al-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he said, يُرْفَعُ لِلرَّجُلِ مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ رُبْعُهَا أَوْ ثُمْنُهَا أَوْ نِصْفُهَا. He said sometimes a person prays, only 1/8 of it ascends towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning if his prayer was 2 minutes, only 1/8 of those 2 minutes spiritually counted for him. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers that a salat. Still minimal reward will be given to him. But the spiritual impact only of 1/8 will be felt. He said what? وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى. But in order to make up for that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يُتِمُّ ذَلِكَ بِالنَّوَافِلِ. He legislated the nawafil so that you could make up for that time. Now, question for you, and I want to continue with the discussion. Within our cultures, how much of a thing is nawafil? We're now coming closer to the month of Muharram. When I go through Muharram, yes, which is a month that is, overflowing with the love of the Ahlul Bayt, as it should. But when I show my affection and love for the Ahlul Bayt, does that ever have an impact on how I pray? Does that ever have an impact on what my worship looks like? What my ibadah looks like? For the average person, the answer is no. For the average Shi'i, the answer is no, and that's a problem. Because this is not how the Ahlul Bayt taught us. When you look at the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt, then you look at ourselves, you say, wow, we're not there, we're not even close, we're not even aiming in that direction. This is the problem. So I have more shortcomings than you, but are we at least aiming in the right direction? That's the problem. This culture of the Ahlul Bayt is not the culture we have. There's big gaps between the two, yes? So, this is why we read this story, famous story of the life of the fourth Imam, Al-Imam As-Sajjad, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, where a companion is in the gathering of the sixth Imam. Now we'll relate how it relates to the fourth Imam in just a second. But he is in the gathering of the sixth Imam. Thank you very much, thank you. He's in the gathering of the sixth Imam, in the companionship and in the presence of the sixth Imam. The sixth Imam is speaking of the worship of the first Imam. Yes? The sixth Imam saying, my great-grandfather, yes, this is what his worship was like, so on and so forth. Then he says, the first person or the only person who ever came close in terms of worship to my great-grandfather was the fourth Imam, which is his grandfather. Yes? He said, but even the fourth Imam, when he used to look at the worship of his great-grandfather, meaning the first Imam, he knew he falls short there. But this is the point I want to emphasize. Because then he narrates, he says, my father, this is the sixth Imam saying my father, meaning the fifth Imam, when he used to go and visit his father, meaning the fourth Imam, yes? He says he used to see him heavy in worship, heavy in ibadah. He says, one day I went, I could tell his legs are inflammation, yes? Because of how long he's been standing. Eyes have marks on them because of how much he's been crying. The forehead has left, yes, a mark on it because of how much he's been in sajda. So the fifth Imam says, I saw my father in this situation. I felt bad for him for a second. I felt I was, overtaken by emotion when you see a loved one in this position. Then he pointed to me, he said, Ya bunayya, my dear son, a'tini ba'da tilka al-masahif. Go and bring those papers to me, or whatever they had back in the day that they used to use, yes? The parchments and so on and so forth. He said, I brought it. In those parchments, there was descriptions of the life of the first Imam. And he said, my father, the fourth Imam, looked into these parchments. And then he took a deep breath. And he said, but who can worship like this? Who can worship like Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, sallallahu Muhammad wa Muhammad. He said, then he put aside the parchments, almost as if he's disappointed in himself. Yes? He set aside the parchments. What is this culture of the Ahlul Bayt? What is this sense that they have? And then what is the sense that we have when it comes to salat and when it comes to worship? No, the sense we have, brothers and sisters, is, yes, it's this thing you kind of have to do. It's not so important. Who cares? The Ahlul Bayt were crying about this day and night. They were worried about this. They were concerned about this. When their worship fell short, they were worried about it. I have to learn from them. See, all of us sitting here today, yes, if you walked in from this entrance, you saw this beautiful flag, which by the way has been brought from the shrine of our beloved third Imam, Al-Imam Al-Hussein, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, sallallahu Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. You and I walk under this flag. Yes, we show our allegiance to this flag. But when it comes to their culture, we don't implement their culture. Their culture was a culture that was very serious about worship. It's very serious. And out of all of the acts of worship about salat, they took it seriously. The fourth imam is crying. The narration says, I saw him praying hundreds of raka'at. وَكَانَتِ الرِّيحُ تُمِيلُهُ بِمَنْزِلَةِ السُّنْبُلَةِ. So I saw he's so standing there in his salat. He is so firm in his salat. He is so particular about his salat. Nothing's moving from him in his salat. And his body is fully stationary, fully calm, except that which the breeze was moving from him. Yes? Like the breeze was coming, maybe his clothes was going back and forth. And of course, we can never get there. Of course, this is that. But are we even aiming in that direction? That is the question. Let me put it this way. Inshallah, with this, I'll wrap up this first khutbah, brothers and sisters. If I go through the month of Muharram, if I wear black and I cry and all the things that we should do, and I come out of Muharram the other way, and I'm not more concerned about my worship, and my worship is the same worship it was before, and my salat is the same salat it used to be before, then I did Muharram wrong. Then this was not the Muharram that the third Imam had in mind for me. This is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had in mind for me. If I go through all of this, all of the time that we dedicate in the month of Muharram, and we should, and then I come out the other way, and my salat is still the same salat. And when I come across haram, it's the same, chill attitude. Like, yeah, it's not a big deal. This is haram, but it's okay. It's not a problem. Whose footsteps am I walking in? Which flag am I walking under? Whose allegiance have I accepted? This is not the way they live their life. In the Shi'i culture, unfortunately, we have this understanding that yes, this love of the Ahlul Bayt is everything you need. This is what you need. This is the most important thing. What the Ahlul Bayt taught us is that without the love of the Ahlul Bayt, the other things you do doesn't carry value. That's what they taught us. They did not teach us that when you do have the love of the Ahlul Bayt, the rest doesn't matter. These two are very different from each other. One more time. What they taught us is without the love of Ahlul Bayt, whatever else you do doesn't carry much value. And that is very true. Of course, for someone who knows who the Ahlul Bayt are and turns away from them. Yes, how many narrations do we have? It says, Islam bunya ala khams. We don't have one or two narrations on this. We have multiple narrations on this. Bunya al-Islam ala khams. Islam was based off of 5 practices. Yes? There's salat and there's fasting and this and that. And the 5th, of course, is what? Is al-wilaya. It's the acceptance of the Ahlul Bayt. Yes? And the Imam said, without this one, everything else has no value. The one who knowingly turns away from the Ahlul Bayt, his acts of worship don't carry much value. They said without that, nothing else matters. They didn't say with that, you don't have to care about everything else. This is a very common misconception that we have. No, I'm preparing for the month of Muharram. When the month of Muharram is coming around, that means now I have to make my culture like the culture of the Ahlul Bayt. And their culture was a culture where they were concerned about their acts of worship every day and night. Maybe I go through this Muharram, maybe now I do a nafilah every now and then. Maybe now I start making up for those qada prayers, crying for the Ahlul Bayt, beating my chest, all these things that we should do. This is where it shows itself. Otherwise, why is the 4th Imam crying like this and concerned like this? And then I go through this whole month and I come out exactly the same on the other side. This is a very minimal benefit from the month of Muharram, if God forbid we end up being like this. With that, inshallah, we'll bring this first khutbah to an end. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين أثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا ثم أصلي وأسلم على نجيبه وجليله وحافظ سره الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأراضين بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين وعلى سبطي نبي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في أرضك صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات. عباد Allah, أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin the second khutbah by reminding all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We reached verses 27 onwards of Surah Al-Qaf. قَالَ قَرِينُهُ. The day of judgment has now come. And the person who was supposed to enter hellfire, the one who is with him, his companion, his acquaintance, turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and argues in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَالَ قَرِينُهُ رَبَّنَا مَا أَتْغَيْتُهُ. We were not the ones who misguided him. وَلَكِنْ كَانَ فِي ضَلَالٍ بَعِيدٍ. You know what happened? He was misguided himself. Why are the people of hellfire arguing on the day of judgment? In this world, you argue over things because there's a chance you'll walk away winning the argument. On the day of judgment, there's no winning in arguments. So Quran tells us everything is based off of the truth. Everything comes to light. You can't trick anybody on that day. Why are these people arguing on that day? Even though they know that they're not going to get away with anything. On the day of judgment, the truth is clear. It's clear to everybody. So he knows he's not going to get away with anything. But he still argues on that day. And in other verses of the Quran, it tells us that people know they won't get away with anything, but they still lie on the day of judgment. Why? Why are they lying when you know there's no way out of this? You still lie. What's the reason for this? Because the day of judgment is a manifestation of how this person lived his life in this world. His ugly habits are now translating into the next world. It's not about benefit or not benefit. It's not about getting away with anything or not getting away with anything. He argued in this world every single time someone told him you have to take accountability. He argued. So he brings that ugly habit with him onto the day of judgment as well. So he argues over there. There's no point in arguing, but he argues because that's his reality. That has become part of his character. That is who he is. In this world, he used to lie. They bring him into the next world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you worship the wrong things. And the verses of the Quran say, no, Ya Allah, swears by Allah. I swear by Allah, I didn't worship the wrong things. But you did. He lies. He knows he can't get away with anything. But that's the reality of who he has become. The Quran teaches us those habits that we do, that we continuously go back to, it becomes part and parcel of the character of the human being. So when the day of judgment comes around, he is lying, he is arguing, not because he can get away with anything. It's because that's become part of who he is. So the Quran says, they start to argue. How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala respond to this? قَالَ لَا تَخْتَصِمُوا لَدَيَّ. The Quran tells them, stop arguing in my presence. وَقَدْ قَدَّمْتُ إِلَيْكُمْ بِالْوَعِيدِ. I told you this day was going to come. You knew the actions that you're committing, the results of your deeds. You knew this day was going to come. وَقَدْ قَدَّمْتُ إِلَيْكُمْ بِالْوَعِيدِ. Now, pause here. Question. Inshallah, this is a lecture I'm preparing. Inshallah, we'll have it soon. When the Quran says, وَقَدْ قَدَّمْتُ إِلَيْكُمْ بِالْوَعِيدِ, I gave you the news of this punishment. That means that everyone who enters into this hellfire knows very well and knew very well what was going to happen. So if someone didn't know, is God going to hold him accountable to this? Obviously not. Someone didn't know. He was raised in a different world. He heard about Islam, but the propaganda was so negative, he never looked into it. He looked into it, but he wasn't fully convinced of it. Between him and his God and his Lord, at the bottom of his heart, he didn't reach the conclusion that this is the faith to follow. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold him accountable and punish? No. Because the Quran tells us, every single person, before they enter into hellfire, they ask them what? Alam ya'tikum rusulun? Did the messengers not come to you? Did they not tell you about this day? Every single person says, yes, I received this message and I knew what I was doing. Okay, now you're worthy of hellfire, sure. But the one who doesn't know, this is not what the Quran teaches us. وَقَدْ قَدَّمْتُ إِلَيْكُمْ بِالْوَعِيدِ مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلَ لَدَيَّ. The promise I gave, there's no changing it. The promise was what? That the disbeliever, the kafir, the anid, the one who has animosity towards God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throws him into hellfire. That's a pretty high bar, by the way. Yes? Kaffarun anid, an enemy of God. The Quran is making very clear. This is my promise. مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. I'm not changing my promise on this day. That person will have to deal with what? Will have to deal with the punishment of hellfire. مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. And then look at this line. وَمَا أَنَا بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. And I am not the one to do any injustice to my servants. No. If you make your way into hellfire, you are fully worthy of it. You are fully worthy of it. And it's interesting because the Quran uses a very interesting terminology. Dhallam is different from dhalim. You guys heard dhalim before? Dhalim means the oppressor. The Quran said, وَمَا أَنَا بِالظَّالِمٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. That's not what the Quran said. It said, وَمَا أَنَا بِالظَّلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. Dhallam means the one who does a lot of oppression. Like alim and allama, yes? Okay, so why is the Quran saying, I don't do a lot of oppression? Because the Mufassirin, they came and said, because God, He is so far from injustice that even a little bit of it would count as a huge amount of injustice for Him. That's why He says, وَمَا أَنَا بِالظَّلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. I would never do such a thing. Even a small amount of it coming from me is considered what? Dhallam, a lot of injustice. Even the small amount, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He considers it a lot for Himself. So I don't engage in that. وَمَا أَنَا بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. I don't do injustice upon my servants. Yes? Anyone who ends up there, he is worthy of it, brothers and sisters. You know, the meaning of these verses of the Quran were unclear to us. To a lot of us, I think, including myself. Yes? Unclear. How can a human being become worthy of this? How can a human being reach this point? Then you find there are people, when children are burning alive and children are, hungry and starving, they'll say, yes, this is what has to happen. Then you understand the verses of the Quran. Then you realize God knows people more than you know people. How is it possible that this can sit well with you, that as long as your family is taken care of, other children, you will go and stop the aid. You will go and stop the food, the medicine, and you see the footage that's coming out of that part of the world. Not just Palestine, there's other parts of the world too. And you'll find there's people support this. And you always wondered, how is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throwing people into hellfire? How does this even make sense with His mercy? It's because you don't know people. It's because I don't know people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows people better than you and I know people. He said, no, my promise holds true. You did this in this world, you are worthy of this. You're an enemy of God, you are worthy of this. So Quran said, يَوْمَ نَقُولُ لِجَهَنَّمْ. The day we turn to hellfire and we ask hellfire, هَلْ امْتَلَأْتِ. Are you full? وَتَقُولُ هَلْ مِن مَزِيدٍ. And the hellfire says, no, I'm not full. In other words, if there's any other enemy of God, there's room for him here. This doesn't mean God throws everyone into hellfire. No, that's not what the verse is saying. The verse is saying for an enemy of God, hellfire always has room. This is what the verse of the Quran is saying. Yes, there are people, brothers and sisters, when their reality starts to show itself, it's so ugly. You don't even want to be associated with that. So yes, we read the verses of the Quran and we think these verses are very harsh. No, leave it to the Creator who knows best. Who carries what in their hearts? Yes? And I say this because growing up, many of these verses were verses that raised questions for me personally. So how is this possible? A God this merciful, hellfire like this, hellfire like that? Well, you need to meet more people. And then you realize there are people in the world who will be okay with starving a child so that they will stay in power. So that they will have the ability to live their lives normally. And in fact, if you were to raise any objection to it, they will label you, they will attack you, they will target you, they will do everything in their power. Is there anything more satanic? This is what this is. So the verse of the Quran said, definitely, this is my promise. This person is going to be thrown into the hellfire. So now question, this person who is an enemy of God, what about the one who's not an enemy of God? What about the one who doesn't have animosity towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I'm a sinner. So where is my situation going to end up? And beautifully, the verses of the Quran always categorize people into two main categories. So there's the one who has animosity towards God, and then there's a second category. Who's the second category? He says there is a second category, they will make it to heaven. Now sometimes immediately, sometimes eventually. That just depends on who they are. But that category is awwab, the one who keeps coming back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you sin, when I sin, do I just sit there and say, it's not a big deal, who cares? Or do I fear the consequences of my deeds enough to say, no, this sounds scary, let me return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And is this too much that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking you and I of? Did He ask you and I to be perfect? Did He ask you and I to never do anything wrong? Or did He ask you and I to show this level of respect that you understand your deeds have consequences? And when you've done the wrong thing, you come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Awwab means the one who keeps coming back. You committed this sin? Okay, come back again. Oh, but I committed the sin again. I come back again. So the companion of the fifth Imam, Al-Imam Al-Baqir, Salawatullahi wa alayhi, he had this conversation with the fifth Imam. It's a beautiful conversation, short conversation. Muhammad ibn Muslim, famous companion of the fifth Imam. He turned to the fifth Imam, he said, Ya ibn Rasulullah, there's a person, he's committed a sin, he repents. But then he breaks his promise again, commits the same sin again, comes back and he repents again. So the fifth Imam turned towards him, he said, okay. So, he said, but what is he supposed to do now? He's broken this promise multiple times, he's repented multiple times, the same sin. And the fifth Imam told him, yeah, he's supposed to come back and repent again. He said, Idhan, if that's the case, then his sins are going to be many. And he said, yeah, every time he sins, he's supposed to come back. Then the fifth Imam sensed a little bit of doubt in the words of Muhammad ibn Muslim. Yes? So he turned to him. He said, Muhammad, are you suggesting that there's ever going to come a time where this believer comes back and repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his sin and God's not going to forgive him? Is that what you're insinuating? Is that what you're implying? I keep telling you, he's supposed to come back again and again. Then you're sitting there and you're saying, but that's too much. Muhammad ibn Muslim, Atara, is this what you think? That there's ever going to come a time where he comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, no, you've repented too many times in the past? No, as long as I come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of the day, then I don't fall under this category of the enemies of God. The enemy of God is the one who sins and he continues down this path and he doesn't even care enough to look back and say, this was wrong what I did. Yes? And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from being such individuals, those who are committing these atrocities, ongoing now for 250 something days, 260 days maybe. These are individuals, yes, who fall under this category. And the Quran will tell them on that day, مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. This was my promise. If you become an enemy of God, hellfire has more than enough room for you. And not just that person, the people who make decisions, but people who actively support those decisions. This is why the Quran says, when we turn to hellfire, هَلِمْ تَلَأْتِ, are you full? وَتَقُولُ هَلْ مِن مَزِيدٍ. No, I have room for every enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. مَنَّاعٍ لِلْخَيْرِ, as the verse said, the one who stopped good at every opportunity that he had to do that. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from, God forbid, becoming such individuals. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. I want to thank one more time the dear brothers who have set up the flag, this beautiful flag that's been brought from the shrine of our third Imam, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those who will truly walk under the flag of our beloved third Imam. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب. يا محسن قد أتاك المسيء أنت المحسن أنا المسيء. وقد أمرت المحسن أن يتجاوز عن المسيء. أنت المحسن أنا المسيء. فبحق محمد وآل محمد صل على محمد وآل محمد وتجاوز عن قبيح ما تعلم مني. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما. قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسي السماوات والأرض ولا يهوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم. صلوات.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. صلى الله على محمد. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. صلى الله على محمد. وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله أكبر اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف الله أكبر بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، واستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام، وأتوب إليه. Inshallah, recite dua ibadat all together. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. La ilaha illallah ilahan wahidan wa nahnu lahu muslimun. La ilaha illallah wa la na'budu illa iyyah mukhlisina lahu ad-din walau kariha al-mushrikun. La ilaha illallah Rabbuna wa Rabbu abaina al-awwalin. La ilaha illallah wahdahu wahda anjaza wa'ada wa nasara abda wa azza junda wa azama al-ahzaba wahda wa lahul mulk wa lahul hamd yuhyi wa yumit ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. صلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد.